The fire started at midnight on Christmas Eve. By the time it was out, 5 children were gone, and the family who lost them spent the rest of their lives insisting the official story was wrong. What happened at the Sodder house in the small hours of December 25th, 1945, was ruled an accidental house fire by local authorities almost immediately. Case closed within days. But George and Jennie Sodder never accepted that ruling, not for a single day of the remaining decades of their lives, and the physical evidence they gathered on their own time, without the help of any official investigation, is the reason this case is still being discussed nearly 80 years later. Because if the Sodders were right about even part of what they came to believe, then 5 children did not die in that fire at all. They were taken. And whoever took them may have planned it for weeks before that Christmas Eve ever arrived. Stay with me, because this story does not end where the official report says it does. To understand why this case has held on for 8 decades, you first have to understand who the Sodder family actually was, and why some of their neighbors may have wanted them gone. George Sodder was born in Sardinia, Italy, and immigrated to the United States as a teenager in the early 1900s, eventually settling in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a small coal town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. He built a life there through sheer determination, working his way up from a laborer on the railroad to running his own successful trucking and coal hauling business. By the 1940s, George and his wife Jennie, herself also an Italian immigrant, had 10 children and owned a comfortable 2-story home on Route 16, a modest but genuine symbol of the American dream George had worked his entire life to build. George Sodder was also, by every account from people who knew him, deeply and vocally opinionated, and one particular opinion he held put him directly at odds with a segment of his own community. George was an outspoken critic of Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism, at a time when a portion of the local Italian immigrant community in West Virginia held sympathies for Mussolini's regime back in Italy. This was not a minor disagreement kept quietly at home. Neighbors and relatives, who later spoke to journalists and investigators, described George as someone who would argue loudly and publicly against anyone he heard expressing pro-Mussolini sentiment, sometimes in local shops, sometimes in the middle of otherwise ordinary conversations. In a tight-knit immigrant community where those sympathies ran in both directions, this made George Sodder a known and, to some, an unwelcome figure. According to accounts given by Sodder family members years later, this tension had already produced at least one direct confrontation. A life insurance salesman who visited the Sodder home sometime before the fire reportedly grew hostile after George refused to purchase a policy, allegedly telling George, according to family recollections, that his house would burn down and his children would die as a form of punishment for his outspoken political opinions. It's worth being honest here that this specific exchange comes from family recollection rather than an independently corroborated record, and its exact wording has varied slightly across different retellings over the years. But the Sodder family maintained consistently from the very earliest days after the fire that a specific threat like this had been made against them prior to the disaster. They also pointed to smaller, stranger incidents in the months leading up to that Christmas Eve. A man they did not recognize, reportedly asking unusual questions about the family's routine, was seen parked near the house, watching it for an extended period on at least one occasion, according to statements from Sodder family members and at least one neighbor. None of this, taken individually, would necessarily be considered alarming in any other context. But taken together with what happened next, the Sodders came to believe every one of these small details had been part of a deliberate plan. On the night of December 24th, 1945, the Sodder family had spent the evening together in an ordinary, happy way. Several of the older children were out that night, some working, one serving overseas in the military, but 9 of the 10 Sodder children were home for the holiday, along with George and Jennie. The younger children had stayed up later than usual, excited for Christmas morning, playing with new toys their mother had allowed them to open a day early. Jennie Sodder went to bed sometime after 11, and the household settled in for the night. Sometime after midnight, according to Jennie's later account, she was woken by a strange sound, something like an object striking the roof of the house, followed shortly afterward by the sound of what she believed to be an animal running across the roof itself. She checked on the household briefly, but found nothing alarming, and went back to sleep, a decision she would spend the rest of her life regretting. She woke again a short time later to the smell of smoke and the sight of flames already visible inside the house. What followed, according to Jennie and George's own later accounts and the accounts of the surviving children who were present, was a chaotic, terrifying scramble to get everyone out of a house that was already burning rapidly out of control. George, Jennie, and 4 of the children made it out safely. Marion, one of the Sodder daughters, escaped through a window and ran to a neighbor's house to call for help, only to discover the neighbor's phone line, for reasons never fully explained, was not working that night. George attempted repeatedly to reach the upstairs bedrooms where several of the younger children were believed to still be sleeping, but the stairs leading up were already engulfed in flame, and a ladder he normally kept propped against the side of the house for exactly this kind of emergency was, according to his own account, missing from its usual place. In a desperate attempt to reach an upper window, George tried to move one of his own coal trucks close enough to the house to climb up onto its bed and reach the window from there. Both trucks, which had started and run normally just hours earlier, reportedly failed to start that night. By the time a passing motorist spotted the fire and drove into town to alert the fire department, since the Sodder home itself had no telephone connection working that night either, and by the time the volunteer fire department was actually able to assemble a crew and drive out to the property, the house had already burned to the ground. The response time has been cited in multiple retellings as taking several hours from when the fire was first noticed, an extraordinarily long delay for a fire department serving a fairly small, close-knit community. By morning, the house where George and Jennie Sodder had raised their family for years was a smoking pile of ash and rubble. 5 of their children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, ranging in age from roughly 5 to 14, were never found among the ruins. The official explanation arrived almost immediately, and it was straightforward. Investigators concluded the fire had started due to faulty electrical wiring somewhere within the house, and that the 5 missing children had died in the blaze, their remains presumably having been completely consumed by a fire hot and prolonged enough to leave nothing identifiable behind. Within roughly a week of the fire, a death certificate was issued for all 5 children, listing the cause of death as the fire itself, despite the fact that no physical remains, bones, teeth, or any other identifiable material had actually been recovered from the site. For George and Jennie Sodder, that explanation immediately felt wrong, and the more they examined the physical details of that night, the more convinced they became that something else had happened entirely. The first problem they identified involved the fire itself. Their local power company had, according to Sodder family accounts, come out to inspect the home's electrical wiring specifically in the weeks before the fire, and had reportedly found the wiring to be in generally sound condition at that time, which the Sodders felt directly contradicted the official explanation that faulty wiring had caused the blaze. The second problem involved how quickly and completely the fire had spread. Survivors and neighbors who witnessed the fire that night described flames that seemed to engulf the entire structure with unusual speed, consistent, in the Sodders' view, with an accelerant having been used rather than an ordinary electrical fire slowly working its way through a wooden structure. The third, and perhaps most significant problem involved the missing ladder and the 2 non-functional trucks. George Sodder maintained for the rest of his life that both details represented deliberate sabotage rather than coincidence, someone having specifically removed his ladder and disabled both of his vehicles in advance, ensuring that, whatever happened that night, there would be no way for him to reach the upstairs windows where the younger children slept. But the detail that convinced the Sodders most completely that their children had not actually died in that fire came from the fire itself, and from what should have remained after it. Multiple accounts describe the fire chief who responded that night, eventually assuring the family that a fire hot enough and prolonged enough to leave absolutely no identifiable skeletal remains whatsoever was, according to standard understanding of fire behavior and cremation science at the time, considered highly unlikely for a house fire of the duration described. Human bone, unlike soft tissue, generally requires sustained extreme heat over a significant period to be fully consumed, well beyond what a typical residential structure fire, even a fast-moving one, was believed capable of producing in the time frame described that night. The Sodders reportedly conducted their own search of the ashes and surrounding property in the days and weeks after the fire, and found no trace of bone, teeth, or any other remains at all. Later, in what would become one of the most cited physical pieces of evidence in the entire case, George Sodder had several truckloads of dirt covering the former foundation excavated and sifted through as thoroughly as he could manage, and again, according to his own account, found nothing. Convinced that his children had somehow survived and been taken rather than killed, George Sodder spent the rest of his life pursuing every lead he could find. He erected a large billboard visible from the highway near his home, featuring photographs of all 5 missing children alongside a standing cash reward for any credible information about their whereabouts, a reward that remained in place for decades and grew significantly over time as the family added to it. He hired private investigators. He wrote letters. He chased leads that arrived from strangers across the country claiming to have seen children matching the descriptions of his missing sons and daughters. Several of those leads produced genuinely strange, never fully resolved details that have kept this case alive in public interest far longer than most similar disappearances from this era. A woman working at a hotel in a nearby town reportedly told the Sodders that she had seen the 5 children pass through on the night of the fire itself, in a car with out-of-state license plates, accompanied by adults she did not recognize as being from the local area, and that one of the adults had reportedly made a remark to her along the lines of the children's parents being asleep and unaware they had left. The Sodders found this account credible enough to pursue seriously, though it was never independently confirmed. Perhaps the single most famous piece of evidence in the entire case arrived years after the fire, in the form of a photograph mailed anonymously to Jennie Sodder. The photograph showed a young man, age estimated to be in his mid-20s at the time the photo was taken, whose facial features, according to the family and several independent observers who compared it against childhood photographs, bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, one of the missing boys, aged as he would have been expected to look years after the fire. Written on the back of the photograph was a short, cryptic message, reading roughly along the lines of a reference to Louis Sodder and Faye, believed to possibly refer to a location or a name connected to wherever the photograph had originated, along with a partial phrase suggesting the children were being kept safe and that their whereabouts would remain hidden, though the family found the note too ambiguous to fully interpret. The Sodders hired a private investigator specifically to trace the photograph's origin, and pursued this lead seriously for a significant period, though it was ultimately never conclusively resolved either way. It remains, to this day, one of the most debated single pieces of physical evidence in the entire case, cited by people who believe the children survived as compelling supporting evidence, and dismissed by skeptics as an unrelated photograph of a young man who simply happened to bear a passing resemblance, mailed by someone whose motives, whether a cruel hoax or a genuine tip, were never established. Beyond individual leads, the broader context of the era itself gave the Sodders' theory more traction than a similar claim might receive today. Organized crime networks connected to mafia activity were documented as operating in parts of the region during this period, and some retellings of the case have connected the fire to speculation about organized crime involvement, potentially tied to disputes within the local Italian immigrant community, though this connection has never been substantiated with hard evidence and remains firmly in the realm of theory rather than established fact. There was also, separately, a documented pattern of extremist and pro-fascist sentiment that had genuinely existed within some segments of Italian immigrant communities across the United States during the years leading up to and during World War II, which lends at least contextual plausibility to the idea that George Sodder's outspoken anti-Mussolini views could have made him a target for some kind of retaliation, though, again, no direct evidence has ever definitively connected any specific individual or group to the fire itself. What can be said with more confidence is that the investigation into the fire, by any reasonable modern standard, was handled with significant irregularities. The initial coroner's inquest into the children's deaths was conducted remarkably quickly, and no thorough forensic search of the fire site for remains appears to have been conducted by official investigators at all, with the burden of that search effectively falling to the grieving family themselves. Requests the Sodders made in subsequent years for the case to be more seriously reopened and investigated were, according to the family, repeatedly rebuffed or only partially addressed by local and state officials, deepening their conviction that something about the official handling of the case did not add up. George Sodder passed away in 1969, more than 2 decades after the fire, having never recovered his children or received an explanation he considered credible. Jennie Sodder continued the search after his death, maintaining the billboard and the reward, corresponding with investigators, journalists, and members of the public who periodically brought forward new leads, none of which were ever conclusively verified, until her own death in 1989. The surviving Sodder children, several of whom lived into recent decades, continued to speak publicly about the case for the rest of their lives, maintaining their parents' belief that their siblings had not died in that fire, and expressing frustration that no official investigation had ever definitively resolved what actually happened. In more recent years, journalists and true crime researchers revisiting the case have generally agreed on one key point, regardless of which specific theory they personally find most plausible, that the original 1945 investigation was genuinely inadequate by any reasonable modern forensic standard, leaving enough real, documented gaps in the physical evidence that the case has never been, and likely never will be, definitively closed to everyone's satisfaction. To be clear about where the actual evidence stands today, no remains of any of the 5 missing Sodder children have ever been found or identified, not at the fire site, and not anywhere else in the more than 75 years since that Christmas Eve. No credible sighting has ever been officially confirmed. No suspect has ever been named, charged, or definitively connected to the fire through solid physical evidence. The official cause of the fire itself, faulty wiring, remains the only formally recorded explanation on record, even though the family who lived through that night never accepted it, and even though several of the physical details surrounding the fire, the missing ladder, the non-functional trucks, the disconnected phone lines, the reported absence of any recovered remains, despite a thorough search, have never been fully or satisfactorily explained by that official version of events either. What makes this case different from so many other unsolved disappearances is not any single piece of dramatic evidence. It is the sheer accumulation of small, individually explainable coincidences that, taken together, never stopped feeling deliberate to the people who lived through that night. A ladder that was always in its place, gone. 2 trucks that ran fine hours earlier, suddenly dead. A phone line, cut. A fire that grew faster than anyone expected. And beneath all of it, a fire chief's own professional doubt that a blaze of that duration could have left absolutely nothing behind. George Sodder kept that billboard standing along the highway for the remainder of his life. 5 faces looking out at passing cars for decades. A standing reward attached beneath them that grew larger with every year no answer arrived. It was eventually taken down after Jennie's death in 1989, more than 40 years after the fire that started it all. To this day, no one has ever definitively proven the Sodder children died in that fire, and no one has ever definitively proven they didn't. So here is what I want to know from you. Looking at everything the Sodder family gathered on their own, with no help from any official investigation, do you think those 5 children died in that house? Or do you think, somehow, they made it out? Leave your take in the comments, because cases like this one tend to draw out details and local knowledge that even decades of research sometimes miss. And if you want to keep digging into the mysteries that official records never fully closed, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is far from the last unanswered case we're going to look into.